Hello everyone, Mr. B here. We are here one more time to finish up Chapter 13. And if we look at the review guide, we will see that there's just a few more things to answer in these last few modules. And we are going to be covering 3 modules today, so let's get right into it. And so if you recall, we started talking about various psychological disorders. In the last video, we talked about anxiety-related disorders and then dissociative and somatic symptom and related disorders. Now we're going to go into mood disorders. And what we mean when we talk about mood disorders is kind of just that. It's disorders that are looking at a severe or persistent disturbance in one's mood, whether it's through extreme sadness, so an extremely low mood that is persistent and severe, or also extreme elation, so a mood that is kind of way up there beyond the extremes, and also severe and persistent. And the 2 main ones that we're going to be talking about in this class are major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. So you might have heard of depressive disorder or major depressive disorder before. And there are many different symptoms to major depressive disorder. So this is when you have extreme feelings of sadness, worthlessness, changes in sleep and appetite. You can be lethargic, so kind of not having any energy, a loss of interest in something that once brought you pleasure. There's a psychomotor disturbances, so it's feeling like you just can't get started, you can't get out of bed, an inability to make decisions, or an inability to concentrate, or to feel happy. You don't really care about things anymore. We also sometimes see thoughts of suicide or attempts of suicide. And nearly 1 in 5 adults will suffer from depression at some point in their lives. This does not mean that once, you suffer from depression, you have it for the rest of your life. There are situations that can happen in our life where we experience depression, and that's natural. But that isn't to say that it is major depressive disorder. Because again, this is when it's something that is persistent, it's impairing your function, causing a lot of distress. And so the other one that we were talking about, sorry, for the sake of the exam, what I would know for major depressive disorder, and we are going to be coming back very briefly to talk about it in the next few slides, but just kind of knowing some of the symptoms, because you're going to be given a story or kind of a hypothetical about a individual, and you will need to be diagnosing the disorder. Bipolar disorder, on the other hand, is kind of looking at both extremes at the same time. So major depressive disorder was looking at that extreme low. Bipolar disorder is looking at both the extreme low and the extreme high. This used to be known as manic depressive disorder because you would experience depression and what is known as mania. So it's these mood swings that shift from periods of euphoria and elated mood, so these manic episodes, and then periods of depression. And there's also these intervals of normal moods kind of in between. So it's just, again, this is why this is seen as a mood disorder. It's just this mood is going through these extremes. Sometimes you feel really low, then other times feeling really high. And again, a lot of individuals experience this, where, you have times where you're feeling really low, and then, a little while later, you're feeling better, and then maybe feeling really good. Does not necessarily mean it's a disorder. Again, causing that distress, impairing your ability to function. If ever you think you may have one of these, speak to somebody about it. But going back to depression, and one of the different models that we use in describing psychological disorders, we go back to cognitive. And so there's these different cognitive distortions that seem to be linked to depression. And what I mean by that is just these certain thought processes. So the first one is the all or nothing, where you kind of see things in the ultimatums. It's either that things are good or things are bad, which isn't usually the case. Also misplaced blame. So, criticizing yourself, saying that you're at fault for something that's really out of your control. Misfortune telling, so, just thinking that, everything is going bad, why even try, because, you're just gonna end up disappointing. Negative focusing, so again, looking at all the bad things that are going on. Dismissing the positive, so even if something goes well, you're like, oh, well, it wasn't really a big deal, anyone could have done that, just kind of explaining away all the positives. We also have jumping to conclusions. So again, especially when it's focusing on negatives, just assuming, immediately that, oh, this is going to go out of my control and I can't do anything about that, before you even really have the facts. Catastrophizing. So, just exaggerating. One thing goes wrong and it's the end of the world. Emotion-based reasoning. So again, instead of looking at the facts, you're just going by how you feel. And sometimes, especially if you're in this kind of depressive cycle, you might not be thinking as clearly as you think you might. The should-isms. So focusing on, what you should have done or what you have to do. And especially with the should-haves, it's already behind you. If anything, it's learning from the past and growing from it instead of focusing on the past, which you can't change. Name-calling, so again, giving yourself negative labels, saying that you're lazy or you're stupid, things like that. And mistaken responsibility. This is huge, especially when you have people in your life that you worry about and you want to help them and you feel like it's your responsibility because they mean a lot to you. But unfortunately, that is not your responsibility. And a harsh truth is that you cannot change someone, you cannot help a person that does not want that help. You can help, not to say that you can't help them at all. I mean, obviously you can do some help. You can help them find, professionals. You can be there for them. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the responsibility is not on you. And again, those are just some of the cognitive things for depression. We also see that there's some biological factors as well. So for those suffering from depression, we see irregularities in serotonin and norepinephrine. We also see abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Which, hopefully you remember, especially with the hippocampus, is the brain, or the part of the brain involved in regulating thinking, memory, and emotions. These genetic factors seem to play a role in depression as well. So if it runs in your family, you are more likely to also develop it. And even more so for bipolar disorder. There seems to be a strong genetic link. Again, does not necessarily mean that you will have it, but you have kind of this predisposition. You have a higher likelihood. And then talking about suicide, the age that is most at risk of the time of this research is middle-aged and older adults, especially males aged 75 and above. And the reason behind this is, and it's a lot of times overlooked, but in the kind of more elderly population, a lot of times people feel like, the best of their lives is behind them, and so what's the point? And so it's something that's often overlooked. But there is also a rising in suicide among middle-aged women and then young girls aged 10 to 14. So that is a huge issue that needs to be addressed and looked into. When we look at gender, it's a little interesting because 3 times as many men actually commit suicide, whereas more women attempt suicide. And this just has to do with the ways in which people attempt suicide. Males tend to pick ways that tend to be effective. Whereas females, sometimes it's, like swallowing pills, where there is a higher likelihood of making it through. And then when we look at race and ethnicity, we see that white Americans and Native Americans are more at risk for suicide than African Americans and Hispanic Americans. One of the thought processes behind that, for why we see it in white Americans, has to do with the fact where, relatively speaking, and this is a huge generalization, but we see historically that white Americans tend to have this underlying privilege where they don't have as many difficulties growing up. Whereas you see more amongst African Americans, Hispanic Americans. And so the idea is that, growing up there's this resilience that African Americans, Hispanic Americans, minorities develop that white Americans do not. And so when white Americans reach these older ages, they don't have that resiliency when things, unfortunately, sometimes don't go as planned. When looking at Native Americans, the thought process behind that is that essentially right now, the history of Native Americans is being erased. And Native Americans are trying very, very hard to hold on to it, but their land is being taken away, used in ways that they don't want it to be used, and they feel like they are losing a part of who they are, of their identity. And so that can lead to this higher prevalence in suicide. Some myths. People who threaten suicide are only seeking attention. That is not true. You should always take it seriously. If ever there was someone close to you that, threatens for it, seek help for them. A person must be insane to attempt suicide. Not true. Anyone can have those feelings. Hopefully they don't. But it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you or anything like that if you do happen to have those thoughts. But please, again, do seek help. Talking about suicide with a person with depression may prompt the person. No. In fact, it seems like, being open and communicating is very important. And so again, if you are having these feelings, to talk to someone. People who attempt suicide and fail aren't serious. Not true. And then if someone threatens suicide, it's best to ignore it, so as not to encourage repeated threats. Again, no, it needs to be addressed. It needs to be talked about. All right, and so with mood disorders, again, we're looking at the prevalence, we're looking at some of the symptoms, and then some of the features and various combats. And those are the mood disorders. Again, there's many more, but, this is just an intro psych, so we're kind of doing a rapid fire. Now we're getting into kind of the psychological disorder that's so different in symptoms that it has its own category, and that is what we call schizophrenia. And when you have schizophrenia, this is when you cannot, or you have difficulties differentiating between reality and fantasy. And so you can hear things or see things or taste things that aren't there. So your senses, you're sensing things that aren't there, which are hallucinations. Or you can have these beliefs that don't make sense. They're not grounded in fact. And these are known as delusions. And I would know that for the exam, that a delusion is a firm but false belief. So, believing that the entire world is being run by hippos. There's no evidence out there. It doesn't hold up. There's far more evidence disproving it, and yet, if you have a really, really firm belief, no, we're all being controlled by hippos, chances are that would be seen as a delusion, so a firm but false belief. And you can also see a breakdown in logic structure of thinking and speech. And so sometimes there's a thought disorder associated with it as well in schizophrenia. So there's this psychotic disorder, this thought disorder, you have hallucinations, and delusions. It's a very unique psychological disorder. And there's different symptoms. So we have things known as positive symptoms, and then we have things known as negative symptoms. And if you recall from a previous chapter, when we talk about positive, that means adding something. So these are behavioral excesses. So again, those hallucinations and those delusions. It is sensory hallucinations. It's seeing things, tasting things, feeling things, hearing things, all of that, which isn't there. So it's adding stuff. And then these delusions, again, you have these thoughts that most people don't have. It's adding those thoughts, so it's an excess. Whereas negative symptoms is where it's taking it away, so behavioral deficit. So if you're very withdrawn, if you isolate yourself socially, if you have apathy, a lack of facial expressions or emotions. So you just kind of have what's known as a flat affect, where you just don't show any emotions. So again, it's a deficit. It's taking away something that you usually see in most individuals. Another specific type of schizophrenia that has a specific negative symptom is known as catatonic behavior. And the type of schizophrenia is known as catatonic schizophrenia. And this is when individuals suffering from this remain in a motionless state or stupor. So it's like just becoming like a statue, where you just suddenly become very rigid for hours on time without moving, and then suddenly it's like your body's catching up, you suddenly become very agitated, and then go back to being still. And that is a catatonic behavior, which is also seen as a negative symptom. Some causes of schizophrenia. What you will need to know for the exam is there seems to be an oversensitivity of dopamine receptors. So you see more dopamine in individuals suffering from schizophrenia. So remember dopamine for schizophrenia. There's also brain abnormalities. So the prefrontal cortex, we see abnormalities in that, and also the limbic system. Again, there's a genetic component. So there seems to be, if schizophrenia runs in your family, you have a greater risk of developing it yourself. And then there's psychosocial influences, so life stresses. And there's this idea that there's a life stress that can affect your genetics, and this is known as the diathesis stress model, which we are going to be talking about very, very shortly. But this is just an overview again of the percentage, some symptoms, and then causes potentially for it. But we're going to get into personality disorders, which is the last one. And if you recall, when we talked about personalities, also I need to very quickly go back because I realized I already talked about the diathesis stress model. So that's just one of the ways of explaining schizophrenia. Again, that you have this predisposition and then a stressful situation brings it out. Sorry about that. So personality disorder. When we talked about personality in the previous chapter, we said it's a relatively permanent kind of description of your character. Because I mentioned that, there's some instances where even if you're a nice person, there's going to be some instances in your life where you're not going to act as nice. But when your personality does not change, or it changes too often, that's when we see it as a disorder. So a personality disorder is characterized by a rigid personality trait. So that means, that it's not changing. And I would know that for the exam. It's an extremely rigid pattern of behavior. And so the one that we're going to talk about in particular is known as antisocial personality disorder. And a lot of people misinterpret this because they see the word antisocial and they say, oh, this is someone that doesn't want to be around people. Not true at all. In fact, people with antisocial personality disorder are often the life of a party. What we mean by antisocial is that the way that they behave does not follow social norms. They do stuff that most people do not do. And so what I would know about this is some of the categorizations for this. So having irresponsible behaviors. A lack of empathy for others. So you will do whatever it takes to get to the top. You will step on people and you will not care. And then a lack of remorse. Again, that whole not caring. Oops. Which we see over here. So sometimes you'll see that they will engage in criminal activity because they don't care that they're breaking the rules. They don't care that they're hurting other people. It doesn't bother them. The reason why people with antisocial personality disorder tend to be the life of the party is they're that one person that just can stay calm in any situation because they have that lack of remorse. They have that lack of empathy. They're just going to do what they want, and, if you get in their way, you're in trouble. It should be noted, though, most people with antisocial personality disorder are law-abiding individuals tend to be highly intelligent, and have this surface level charm. A lot of people, when they think of antisocial personality disorder, also known as a psychopath or sociopath, they think, oh, that person's dangerous, that person's going to hurt me. And no, that's not true. Most people with antisocial personality disorder are fine. You just wouldn't want to go up against them in like Monopoly or something, because they would be ruthless. They would do whatever it took to win. That being said, we do see that, serial killers, murderers, things like that, you see a higher prevalence of antisocial personality disorder, but you can't then assume that anyone with antisocial personality disorder is then going to be a murderer or serial killer. That's not fair. Alright. And then the other one we're going to talk about is borderline personality disorder. And borderline personality disorder is kind of the opposite of what we just talked about. It's when your personality is just all over the place. So you have these abrupt shifts in mood, this incoherent sense of self, so you don't even know who you are because your personality is all over the place. You're very impulsive. You have these stormy relationships with others because, again, kind of who you are is changing. And a lot of times there's this fear of abandonment. And so that's why it causes a lot of distress, because these individuals want to be around people, they want to be loved, but then their personality's all over the place and it pushes people away. And so this causes this unstable self-image. And so that's what we mean by borderline personality disorder. And then, as always, we see the kind of prevalence of these disorders, some symptoms, and then some features. And that is it. For Chapter 13, so I know this one went a little bit longer than the other ones, but we had to go through 3 different modules. And so all that's left is actually a very short chapter, which is Chapter 14, which is going to talk about the different types of therapies out there that help with these disorders that we've talked about. But again, please do not use this video to self-diagnose. If, after learning about some of these, you think, oh, that really describes me, I might have this, seek some help. See a therapist, a counselor, speak to someone about it. Also, because we did mention depression and suicide, again, it should always be mentioned that if you are having suicidal thoughts, please speak to someone, reach out to someone. You are not alone. But that is it for Chapter 13. We will be back for Chapter 14, and then we will be done with Introduction. I don't know where my pause button is. So I'm going to make this disappear.